I've been recently recruited to participate in several UVM-wide initiatives where the word transdisciplinary appears a lot, and the word participatory less, and maybe action even less. But there's a lot of interest on this campus on some of these things. So I thought that what I'd like to do more than anything is present you the agroecological approach that we're proposing actually in the paper that I sent around. I don't know who got to read it, but it's the first article of a special issue coming out in February where we collected work from people that are more or less following the same perspective. And I'll give some background on that. If you went to the agroecology panel, there's a little overlap, but it's not the same, so just so you know. And just to have a conversation about, you know, the Gund Institute, Ecological Economics have similar principles. And one of the things that I have not been liking about being in these UVM-wide initiatives is that once you sit down, you realize that most of the people around the table have a different perception or definition for a lot of these terms, and I find that really problematic. And then you're being asked to provide recommendations on how to advance these research things. So I thought maybe, you know, it's a good start to do it here at the Gun, because I know that ecological economics describes itself as a transdisciplinary field many times. So that's sort of like the kind of discussion that I hope we can have at the end, and I'm going to try to talk for about 20 minutes or so at the most. And so we'll use agroecology as a case study, but it could actually be any field, any approach. First thing that I always like to say is agroecology and agroecological thinking have been around for a really long time. The first actual published paper in this International Review of Agriculture, which was put out by the organization that later became the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, the FAO, by a Russian agronomist. And I can't use my laser. Basil Benson was concerned about how even at that point in time, a lot of mechanization, industrialization was beginning to be pushed in agriculture as the way to go. And he was really concerned that this would drive the costs of production up a lot. And he came up with this term, agroecology, and wanted to try to do agriculture in a way that you wouldn't need necessarily to bring all these implants and all this machinery. So 40 years later, a group of people, mostly ecologists, really embraced this term and came up with this definition, which you can find in different texts. And I put some of the key textbooks there. Miguel Altieri's, the one in the middle, actually came out in 1987, and even earlier, I think, in Spanish. But most of them are coming from an ecological origin, and they're saying we need to bring ecology, ecological thought, ecological concepts, and applications to agriculture. And in large part, it was a response to the Green Revolution, which was bringing, again, a process of industrialization to agriculture. And these particular people that came up with the agroecology were concerned, one, with environmental impacts, so that was a big one. That's why they wanted to bring ecology, and also their own background in ecology. But two, a lot of them were already working with smallholders in developing countries, and they were seeing how this group could be left out from this new model, right? That was based on economies of scale. So 1970s, 1990s, with the publication of all these books and more research and graduate programs, it advanced. In 2003, the same group of people decided to make a bolder statement and say and define the field as the integrative study of the ecology of the entire food system, and really bring to that definition an interdisciplinarity, right? So ecological, economic, and social dimensions. 2003, I was still in grad school when this came out, and one of my committee members, a political economist of food and the environment, David Goodman, really sharp, really critical thinker. And I remember him critiquing this and saying this is less of a definition and more of a program. Nevertheless, they came up with it, and then Steve Gleesman embraced it in this green book over there. Agroecology was the first textbook. It's actually designed to teach undergraduate students. It's a great book if you ever have to teach an agroecology course at that level. But he changed the title, and he changed a lot of the content, and also called it Agroecology, the Ecology of Sustainable Food Systems. So obviously, this broadening of the definition, this ambitious broadening of the definition, there was a lot of critique, but also a lot of people saw it as something positive, because they saw that at this point in time, really we were thinking more about food systems. People were concerned about food systems, not just what had happened here, which was mostly agricultural production. So what are the impacts of agricultural production at the farm and at the landscape level? When here we were starting to talk more about issues of inequity, the role of consumers, corporate control of food, etc. So in some ways it was embraced by some, critiqued by others. Other developments that have been interesting is how for a long time, because agroecologists were working at smaller scales and with small farmers mostly, you did not see it a lot in the policy circles. And I can't remember when the IISTD came out, early 2000s, I think. And then Oliver de Schutter, who's the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, appointed by the United Nations in 2008, started bringing that up to this level. So there's a lot more people hearing the term, there's a lot more people getting interested. I remember when Agriculture at the Crossroads came out, so I was already here, it must have been 2008, I think is when it came, or 2009. There was a whole NPR program, and there were a lot of articles in the newspapers, and people are bringing this term that was somewhat obscure for a lot of people. And I can tell you, when people ask me, what do you do? And I say, I'm an agroecologist, I always have to explain what it is. What's that? An ecologist? An economist? Other recent developments is that several development organizations, Heifer International does development work in developing countries, embraced agroecology as sort of like its approach. This is a sort of like regional NGO in Mesoamerica, Fundeciran, based in El Salvador, who for years was doing organic farming, and then like 2 or 3 years ago, everything now is agroecological. Farmer organizations like La Via Campesina, which is a global organization of farmer co-ops and organizations, has also embraced agroecology as what they're asking their farmers to do or to manage. The MST in Brazil too, in fact the MST created a few years back Latin American School of Agroecology for farmers. The Venezuelan government has also done, they have a university I think. So it's popping out in a lot of places, and just more and more people are interested. There's also similar approaches which I consider to be a strength. Eco-agriculture is one that has been very prolific. There's been a lot of publications, several books, articles, and it has a similar approach, maybe a little bit more wildlife content, conservation in eco-agriculture than in agroecology, explicitly said. Natural systems agriculture coming out of the Land Institute with Wes Jackson. And I wanted to show a very new one, which is this term diversified farming systems that is being led by Claire Cremens, who's done a lot of ecosystem services work out of UC Berkeley. And this is a special issue coming out in Ecology and Society, forthcoming. And they have a really interesting collection of articles. Of all these, this last one seems to be the one where it's really embraced agroecology rather than separating itself from it. I feel that the other two are more separate, they do their own thing. And of course, this brings territory, right? So there's some of those agroecologists have, tiffed with the eco-agriculture people, and I don't think that much with the Land Institute or West Jackson, but there's territory, there's definitely competition for resources, right? People are trying to get grants. But one of the things that has been interesting with eco-agriculture is that I feel that they've been really good about establishing themselves at the international policy level, which is something that people working in agroecology haven't done that much. More interesting stuff, recent academic reviews of the field and peer-reviewed journals. There's two by Wessel, who's French, and he wrote this one that I like a lot. It's called Agroecology as a Science, a Movement, and a Practice, even though I do have some critiques about it. And then Tom Tomich, who's at the Davis Institute for Agricultural Sustainability, and a lot of different colleagues, reviewing agroecology from a global change perspective. And again, you know, this is good. This is, it's stirred up a pretty healthy debate. I don't think anybody's gotten mad about it, but there's definitely been a debate, right? And some of the pioneers in the field have had their feathers ruffled, I think. But it's also, for me, we recently had a panel where my graduate mentor, Steve Leisman, was here, and we did 3 generations of agroecologists. So it was him, who was kind of like that first, that was the second, and then my grad students, Marcela is the only representative here, see how much they care for me. But it was interesting to see, because one of the things that I raised was like, what were the issues when Steve was thinking about agroecology in the 1970s? You know, I shared some of my issues, and then some of the grads shared, you know, their issues going forward as people getting degrees in this field and moving forward. So brings up the question of what it is, but also what it could be or it should be. And one of the things that has come up in these reviews is that most of them have some sort of a proposition, right, of direction. Where should this field go? And also critique of what this field is and how it got there. So, considering those ruffled feathers, several of us decided to take on that reflection and saying, okay, so, you know, some more than others didn't like what these reviews put out there. What do we think? And something that came up was that, first of all, we should just acknowledge that there's different agroecologies, right? Different people are doing different things, and they're calling themselves agroecologists, just like with ecological economics, right? And so, in fact, again, this should be seen more as a strength than as a weakness. But at the same time, there's dominant perspectives, and it's good to differentiate. And also, one of the things that I felt was that some of the new propositions where the field needs to go were not necessarily taking into account a historical evolution, right, of something that I personally think that it's been an advancement for the field. So the 2 principal ones that we came up with, one is more interdisciplinary. It tends to be more academic. People made an effort to say, you know, the food system is out of bounds because it's too political. So basically, they're really trying to transform agricultural production, right? So these are experiments at the farm level, you know, replacing practices that are damaging to the environment, and making agriculture more ecologically friendly. There's been a lot of really good work coming out of that. The other one that tries to be more transdisciplinary, and why is that? Because there's a lot of emphasis put on local knowledge, especially the knowledge of farmers, right? Bringing farmer knowledge, non-academic knowledge, into this also integration of the disciplines, politically engaged and action-oriented, because the objective is to focus on food systems. So you can't get away from that there's politics, and that actually if you want to change it, you're going to have to think about action at some point. You can't just recommend, right? I mean, you can choose to, but that's what we said. And then there's variance. For example, the article by Tomich and colleagues is really quite in the middle, and like saying we want a certain interdisciplinarity, but more leaning towards natural science research. But we do want to acknowledge that what we're researching is part of a bigger food system. So the paper and the special issue are basically describing what I call an evolving agroecology that values transdisciplinarity, participation, and action orientation. But what's important to think about is that it really has roots in the natural sciences. Like a lot of the people that developed agroecology and took it to this level are ecologists. They're disciplinarians, plant ecologists, insect ecologists. And it was a challenging learning process, and I'm a witness of that because I had these arguments with my advisor about wanting to include social science research. And him being more like, yeah, it's important, but, you know, sure, it's good, but we need to measure all the ecological variables first. And it's like, I'm not going to have any time to do anything else. So, you know, grappling with that, it wasn't an easy process. Transdisciplinarity with including multiple knowledge systems, and this brand of agroecology really values that. It's learning from farmers, you know, traditional agricultural systems. What ecological mechanisms are happening in agriculture that has been going on for long periods of time. So China, Mexico, what can we learn from that? Participation, which is something that came a little bit later, and also the action. So the idea is to bring, you know, these three perspectives together in order to influence and do research on agri-food systems. So a little bit of each one that I wanted to touch base on. I took this talk as an opportunity to dig more about transdisciplinarity. Been showing this slide that I've never liked, so perfect opportunity to change my slide. And I found this definition in a recent article that I liked. It's a reflexive, integrative, method-driven scientific principle. Well, you can read it. But the commonalities that I found in a lot of the stuff that I pulled out was there's the integration of different academic disciplines, the integration of different forms of knowledge. So be it indigenous, experiential, cultural, spiritual, whatever non-academic knowledge. And then the other one, which honestly I've never seen as a big part of transdisciplinarity from my own perspective, which is very problem or issue oriented, right? So we're looking more at a problem than at a disciplinary question and wanting to resolve it. I found a lot of stuff I've never seen before, like this handbook of transdisciplinary research by Springer. This is a Danish journal, Journal of Transdisciplinary Environmental Studies. So a lot of stuff coming out of Europe, but all, everywhere. So 1,500 hits of Web of Science for transdisciplinary. So there's a lot of people doing stuff. The participatory action research is something that I've been doing for a long time, and the idea is to, there's actually two dimensions to this that I think are important. One is that you want to give voice to those who traditionally don't have a voice in the research process. So in my case, that I work a lot with smallholder farmers, a lot of the time smallholder farmers don't direct the research that it's done. You know, I'm the researcher, I come and I say, hey, you know, I want to do this research, and do you want to collaborate? And they're like, oh, you know, I'll probably get something out of it, but it's not usually the farmer coming to me saying, can you do this research because I have this problem? And even if they would, what would I say, right? So the idea is to try to bring these voices that are not usually part of the process to be part of the research process. And the other one is just bringing in different actors, right? Relevant actors. And I find that one even harder because, I don't know if you guys saw Jason Clay yesterday, but the kind of stuff that he likes to do with the roundtables, he brings people that are at odds, right? But it's important. And that's the other dimension of participation that I think is really important and hard to do. But, and honestly, I haven't really done it. I've usually been more on the side of following, this was developed by Paulo Freire, a Brazilian, but his thing is, you know, you need to bring those marginalized voices so that your research can become more useful through some particular action.
Was that pedagogy of the oppressed?
Pedagogy of the oppressed.
They banned that in Arizona recently.
Really?
Are you serious?
Recently?
Yep.
And the third thing that it's action oriented is this notion that it would be nice to really make some changes, right? We are seeing that there are problems with our agri-food system and that these will require some actions at multiple scales. It's a very complex issue. That said, I don't believe that we should be shying away from it, but actually, trying to work on resolving it. And there are several things. There are ecologically based land stewardship, farm, landscape, regional scales, rural livelihoods of farmers in rural communities, and then these more really complicated ones. We heard about RED from Asim last week, but this, RED is something happening at the international level that could affect a lot of people and could affect food systems. Then there's this one, right? Like, who controls the food system right now? Who has the most power? And, I like to put sorry, it's in Spanish, but the coffee chain, starting with the farmer over there who's making 20 cents. So, if you pay $10 for your pound of coffee, the farmer's getting 7.3% of that. Green Mountain Coffee and other roasters in importing countries are getting 44.2% of that with a lot less risk, right? So, does the farmer have any power about that? Well, not traditionally. They don't have a lot of power. So this, I think, is a problem. That there's disproportionate power balance. The power is really leaning more towards this side. And that's the other thing where, consumer-based intervention is important, but consumers don't really even have that much power, right? I mean, they have some power, but not a lot. So it's something to think about. So this is kind of like the conceptual piece. Then I'm just going to give you really quickly 2 examples of how I've tried to do this. And then I'm going to open up for discussion. I have some prompts. So I've been doing this work in Mesoamerica with coffee farmers for 13 years now. And it didn't start a participatory action research process, but it became one. It started as my doctoral dissertation. And I did this weird thing. I was trying to be creative. I don't know if it's going to be confusing, but summarizing 13 years of work, if you see the blue are those areas where I think transdisciplinary has been brought in. The green areas is where participatory approaches were brought in, and then these are more action processes. So it became a participatory action research project with smallholders, and there's been cooperatives coming in and out of it. Right now I'm currently working with 5 in 3 countries. It's not bad. I mean, it's a lot of work, but it's great. One of the things that I did from very early on was help farmers with training. Not necessarily me giving all the training, but also facilitating. And this was part of the participatory action research, is negotiating with the farmers, like, so what, I'm getting a dissertation out of this, and papers, and possibly a job. What do you guys need, right? So honestly, my biodiversity research was not really interesting to the farmers very much. They were really interested in getting certified at that time. So, finding different ways to provide this training and capacity building. Then there was research on biophysical variables, ecological variables, but also social variables, livelihoods, food security, food sovereignty, and also some on the coffee value chain. There's been a lot of partnership. The Community Agroecology Network, which is an NGO that I helped create based in Santa Cruz, California, which has a network of people all over Mesoamerica. And focusing more on that action piece. And Chris Bacon, who's in that picture over there, that I collaborate at Santa Clara, we started our dissertations together and pretty much followed the same approach, parallel to each other. More recent stuff, partner with Oxfam America to do this evaluation of coffee certifications and see how they affected smallholder livelihoods. Pretty big project in 4 countries with, I think, almost 500 households and 18 cooperatives. And this one, the action piece was more trying to influence policy. So Oxfam at that time was really supportive of financing farmers getting certified for organic and fair trade. So giving them sort of like a startup cost, because that was something that they didn't have. But at some point they started feeling like, well, you know, we've invested all this money, but we don't really know how much the families are benefiting. We kind of knew from more qualitative research that cooperatives were benefiting from certifications, but we weren't sure about how much the families. There's been a lot more research on that afterwards, and it's pretty much been all relatively similar findings. When I came to Vermont, I reconnected with Green Mountain Coffee, and that I knew them from before, and started helping them to evaluate the effectiveness of their grant program. They have a program where they fund development projects in their suppliers, for their suppliers, their smallholders. Marcela's actually got a fellowship from one of those projects, and we're still doing it. We also help them develop a monitoring and evaluation tool, so that's sort of like an action piece too. With Linny, we did a short stint on climate change mitigation and coffee smallholder livelihoods, which we might continue to do, I hope. And then I also got a Gun faculty collaborative grant on this. So this is a newer piece of the research, and honestly, I haven't had a lot of farmer input on this one. This has been one that I've done more from here, and that green is more trying to collaborate with new people within the university. But hopefully, once we get going, we can bring this back to the farmers and see what they're thinking about it. The second project, where Azim is also a co-PI, that I'm going to present, is this Vermont Farm Resilience in a Changing Climate Initiative. And I call it an initiative because we have several projects. So Azim and I are in a grant from the Food Systems Spire that we got for 3 years. And then Stephanie Hurley and I got a Hatch grant for 3 years too. That's part of the initiative. We just got another grant from Vermont Community Foundation, and hopefully another one from High Meadows. So it's a lot of stuff coming together under the same. And just a few things about this one. And again, the colors: transdisciplinary in blue, participatory in green, and action-oriented in whatever that is, like orange. And these are the objectives of the project, and we just started in July. And these are the collaborators, and it's definitely a lot of work to be the PI of this project, and but in a good way. We have people from the Rubenstein School, we have 2 representatives from UVM Extension, we have 3 people from Community Development and Applied Economics, and Stephanie Hurley and I are from PSS. We've been lucky to get quite a few students and 1 postdoc under Azim. So it's a lot of people working on this one project, so a lot of management. And one of the reasons that it is manageable is because I have 2 research staff that help me with that, Kate Westdyke and Martha Caswell. And Rachel, who started as a staff person in kind support from the Center for Sustainable Ag, and then became a PhD. And sort of like this is the vision. We're starting looking at farming practices. What practices are farmers in Vermont doing right now that could be have potential for more climate change mitigation or adaptation? And also we're interested in looking at what policies are supportive or not. Azim and Chris Khalib are doing an agent-based modeling and also looking at different scenarios of farmer decision-making under different policies. The grant has a pretty big extension component that is going to come probably in the 2nd and 3rd years, which is once we have identified those practices with potential, then David Connor is going to do a cost-benefit analysis. What would it cost the farmer to implement them? Then we're gonna have workshops on farm to share with other people. And Carol Adair is going to do greenhouse gas emissions measurements and carbon sequestration measurements. So once we've selected those with potential, and we've started with, I don't know how many, like 20 practices for different objectives, and we're
Just
trying
at
to
the
pare
farm
them
level,
down.
those are 20, but if you include policy and management level, then it becomes a lot more.
And so we're trying to pare down. And then once we have those, we'll do research probably on six of those, really in-depth, and then, you know, again, part of that outreach where we share the data with farmers at the same time that they're hearing from a farmer, this is what happens when I have this practice here on this farm. Some of the additional funding, we're hoping to target agricultural service providers, and again, another challenge that we want to target the ones that most people don't target because they're hard to reach, but that everyone admits that they're really important, like crop advisors, and even people that work in agricultural stores. Because, you know, what the extension folks have been telling us is we don't connect with the farmer very much anymore, right? We do these workshops, we do a lot of stuff, but the extension model where you would go and you would see your constituency every month is gone. So these guys see the farmers all the time. And you know, we've had some interest from that sector, but those are the people that are interested. I'm wondering how successful it's going to be to recruit more. So I'm a little bit, but I don't know, we'll try. Today I recruited my first farmer. We want to have like a group of key informants that includes farmers, and also kind of like an advisory board. So I had one farmer said yes, we have one. And then we'll hit other people. So that's all I'm going to present because I want to have some discussion, and these are some prompts. We don't have to limit it to that, but I really do want to discuss this one because you missed this, Taylor, but I was saying that the reason I did this talk instead of presenting some more empirical work, like obviously there's a lot of detail on the El Salvador study that I could have presented on the coffee, as American coffee, but Taylor is at least in one of these initiatives across UVM, and you know, there's a lot of using these terms and very little discussion. And I am not one to get stuck in terms, but I do consider it problematic when people are thinking very different things about an approach and supposedly moving forward with it. So these are some of the points, and I just want to open it up for discussion. Yeah.
I've had a question since somewhere near the beginning. Apparently from your discussion, by the way, my name is Stephen. Apparently there is a distinction between agroecology and ecological agriculture. I've heard the term ecological agriculture sort of displacing organic as a higher model, but it's not at all clear to me. And I can see where ecologically agriculture is about what's happening on the farm and trying to integrate that in an ecological sense. And what I'm hearing, possibly, because you really haven't said, is that agroecology speaks about, you know, creates the ecology as the context for possibilities of agriculture. And I wonder if you could reflect on those.
It depends on who you ask. And that's part of the problem. Because right now, so you talked about ecological agriculture, and we could put that term right in there and say that, you know, similar approaches, similar terms. And for example, ecological agriculture in the European Union really does substitute organic. They have ecological agriculture certification, and they have organic certification, but it is a certification approach too. And I work in Spain, and that's all they use. You almost don't hear that many people calling it organic. But there is a confusion, and I guess part of what I was trying to say, without trying to define each one of these, is that what we're trying to do is to be very specific about what this particular approach of agroecology means. And that's why we've gone to lengths in producing these papers in this special issue,
So could you make a categorical statement that ecological agriculture looks at agriculture and tries to make it ecological, whereas agroecology is looking at the ecology and looking at how you implement agriculture within it? Is that a fair characterization?
Well,
because if
so
that
what
was true, it would be much easier to understand what's going on.
So what I'm saying is that it's not true, because
Okay.
if you go to the lab of Iowa State University and a colleague, Matt Liebman, he does ecological work in agricultural fields, right? And he calls it agroecology. And if you go to Germany, there's an agroecology lab at Göttingen, and what they do is they look really at ecological interactions of farms. They don't do any social research about the farmer or the food system or anything like that. But they call it agroecology, and like I said, we can't have like an agroecology police coming down on you saying you should not be calling yourself that, but what we can do is be very more specific about what we mean by it when we do the work. And there are two dominant, I think, perspectives, and one is more the ecological, what you're talking about, and the other one is more that one, which is the one that I'm sort of pursuing.
You've hit ecology, transition. I'm going to hit on PAR.
Okay.
And I did two things that I think are PAR. And in one case, I tried to call it PR, and they said, no, that's not PR. You can't use that term. We did a study having to do with downtown.
Who told you that?
I forget.
Doesn't matter.
I supervised an honors.
The
police, yeah,
the park police. The park police.
The word police. And it was, I supervised an honors project last year, which had to do with downtowns and downtown development in Vermont. And just like the project we did in St. Lucia, and you mentioned, they have a problem, but they don't know the answer. Sometimes they do. And sometimes we have ideas, that we bring to the table. And then we bounce it off the local people, and then we go back and reformulate our strategy. And I called that PAR, and they said, no, that's not PAR.
But who?
Excuse me?
I mean, I'm asking you who.
The people at UVM who were also part of the supervision of this honors project said, you can't call that PR, it's not PR.
So one of the things that I find interesting is that, when I started working with coffee farmers, I wasn't using a participatory approach. I was trying to do my dissertation, right? And I brought it back later. So, it's sort of like, I would probably disagree with that. I would say a lot of people here do it without calling it. And a lot of the extension people do it. They, resolve problems with farmers, with the farmers' input. I would call that PR, but they don't necessarily call it that.
Like, we weren't changing the policy that we came up with, but we were changing the strategy based on feedback from the local stakeholders.
One thing that people do get a little bit cut off on is with the reflection piece. So there's a lot of emphasis in the PAR literature that it's really important to reflect on your findings together. So if you're the academic and you're the researcher and your non-research partners can be whoever, right? Like the town council.
Right. This was a development council or a body or whatever.
They clearly reflected on the results with the researchers.
Well, we went there and presented the results like 3 times and
they
asked them
came up
for
here.
feedback. That was reflection. And
So basically you were a victim of, because you didn't call it that in the first place. I
was just puzzled.
Yeah, it's just the same thing as transdisciplinary, right? If you don't say that this is transdisciplinary and you're doing everything that characterizes transdisciplinarity.
But you talked about the issue of farmers, especially smallholder farmers, not coming to the researchers with the problems that they have. And that, so therefore it's driven more from your perspective than from the, sorry, not from yours, but from the research perspective as opposed to the actual farmer's perspective. In order to overcome that, would it be possible to get funding almost as a witness to go into areas and to live in them, to establish what the problems are, literally as a listener, not as an actor, but as a listener. And I mean, I know it's expensive. I do know, for mining industries, going into a new area, they're funded obviously by huge corporations, but they send in an anthropologist to sort of identify the issues of the community before they even start negotiations, etc. Find out who the players are, all those sorts of things. But because we're not dealing with large corporations who are willing to give us money, do you see an opportunity?
I mean, like I said, when I started, I wasn't really thinking, I wanted to do something for the farmers, but I wasn't framing it as a participatory action research project. And I went there to do research and basically ask people, can you collaborate? And then through the process, just kind of became that more. And that's when I got more interested and started looking into it. My colleague in Nicaragua, which went through a similar process, but he actually came in doing more action. He was part of a USAID development project, trying to bring quality control labs for the coffee into the cooperatives who'd never had them. So they wanted to give the co-ops negotiation power. So because usually what had been happening is that the buyers would come down from importing countries, cup, and say, we're going to give you this much. And then nobody in the co-op knew how to cut. So they took whatever.
And that was a Green Mountain project, and they did coffee
it was
schools.
USAID funded.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Thanksgiving Coffee led it, and then my colleague Chris helped do that. So he kind of started meeting the farmers that way, and then he decided to do his dissertation, and he actually framed it from the onset as a participatory action research project, where he had learned all these issues in setting up the lab, and he wanted to support the farmers resolve them. So I think there's a lot of different ways to come at this, and you will see in the text a lot of purists that tell you if you don't start the process from the onset, talking to the community about the problems, and they're a part of the research design, then it's not par. That is very hard to do because of funding, because of time, what I find is that a lot of the projects that are longer lasting and that you can see some research and action outcomes have come from very different places, and some of them did not start as a participatory project.
So there is a lot of new transdisciplinary approaches that have emerged, which are essentially trying to look at similar problems. So I'll just list, for example, ecological economics, agroecology, which are the obvious ones here, but also critical ecology.
Yeah.
Then there is a Resilience Alliance, which have their social ecological systems. Then you have sustainability science. And then this is just a brief list. I mean, and all of them claim to be transdisciplinary and problem-oriented, as well as also they have certain element of action orientation. But it varies. Political ecologists are not as much action-oriented as opposed to more Resilience Alliance people who claim that they want to be more action-oriented. So it's, how do you see this? Is this something that you think eventually would merge into one transdisciplinary field, or is it going to be becoming their own paradigms to looking at it from those paradigmatic lenses, and they're going to become their own disciplines?
Yeah, so that's interesting you asked that, because one of the things where I've sort of had tension with the senior agroecologists is that some of them want to call everything agroecology, and I disagree with that. And one of the reasons is that I used a lot of political ecology in my work, and still do, and read a lot of political ecology. And I don't think they're going to merge just because those nuances where they're different might make it difficult. That said, one of the things that will be interesting to see is new generations of scholars and practitioners these types of approaches for the generation previous to me and to most of you, nobody was doing it, right? Most people were disciplinary, and So one thing that I do see is that the newer generations that are getting this earlier and testing it more are going to advance it because they're not going to be grappling with terminology, or hopefully, right? But you know, I don't see that it's necessarily that negative that there's these different fields. There is competition for resources, but you know, I've learned a lot from the political ecology approach, and I found that agroecology just really didn't have some of the some of the sort of like intellectual lens that political ecology had, and that it was really useful to look at certain issues like the multiple scale issues and the livelihoods and economic stuff. So yeah, it's hard to tell. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but maybe later.